All right, so now that we've seen how to define basic custom object types in TypeScript using this type keyword, the next thing that I want to take a look at is how to define more complex types with actual behavior using TypeScript classes. Now, classes are something that are available to us in basic JavaScript. In other words, you don't actually need TypeScript to define classes, but TypeScript's class syntax is quite a bit more advanced than JavaScript's class syntax because it provides things like data visibility on top of being able to define static types for things like the instance variables in the classes we define. All right, so what I want to do here is just walk you through the basic syntax of defining classes in TypeScript. And in order to do this, let's just create a new file in our source directory, and we'll call this something like class basics.ts. And inside here, we'll see how to define a basic class. So, all right, so we just saw how to define a basic person type in TypeScript using the type keyword and this object syntax. So let's see how we can make a slightly more complex version of this person type using TypeScript classes. So, all right, so the first thing to know is that in order to define a TypeScript class, it's just like in JavaScript. All we need to do is say class and then follow that with the name of the class we want to create. So let's create a class called person here. And that's going to be followed by curly braces. And something that's interesting here is you're going to see that this has a little red underline underneath it, and it says duplicate identifier person, and that's because we defined the same person type in our app.ts file. And TypeScript doesn't like us to do that in the same project. So, all right, so what we're going to do here is we're just going to change the name of this class to something like human, okay? So that's just a silly change that helps us avoid that clashing of class names. So, all right, so now that we have this empty class, the way that we define instance variables in classes in TypeScript is a little bit different than in JavaScript, right? With JavaScript, we had to actually create a constructor method and do things like, say, this.name equals Sean, right? Then we'd have to say this.age equals 123, and so on and so forth, right? And that was just the way that we generally had to define those kinds of instance variables in JavaScript. However, TypeScript, as I already said, provides us with some more advanced class-related syntax, and that includes not only being able to define the instance variables right inside our class declaration, right? So if we wanted to add name, age, etc., we could just add them right here by saying name string, age number, and hair color would be a string as well. And you're going to see that that has some red underlines there. That's just because we currently don't have a way to initialize these variables, but we'll see how to do that in just a minute. So anyway, TypeScript not only allows us to define these instance variables right inside the body of the class, but it also gives us a set of data visibility modifiers, such as public, private, and protected, that allow us to determine whether code outside this class is able to access these instance variables. Now, in most cases, it's considered a best practice in object-oriented programming to just add the variable modifier private to all of the instance variables, unless you have a very good reason not to do so, right? Unless you really need to access it outside of that, and it makes sense, in terms of object-oriented programming. So for now, we'll just set all of these instance variables to private. And the next thing that we're going to see how to do is define a constructor. So a constructor is just the function that takes care of setting up new instances and allows us to initialize all of these instance variables to some value. So what we're going to do here is we're going to define a constructor that takes the name, age, and hair color as arguments and sets the initial values of these instance variables to those values that we pass in. All right, so really the only difference here with TypeScript versus JavaScript is that the arguments that we pass to the constructor are going to have static types with them. So we can say name string, age string, or age is number actually, and then hair color, that's going to be a string, okay? All right, and it's assumed that the constructor is just going to return an instance of type human here, so we don't need to add the type declaration onto the end of this constructor. All right, so besides that, the code inside this constructor is just going to take care of initializing these instance variables to a specific value. So in our case, that would be this.name equals name, this.age equals age, this.haircolor equals hair color. All right, so now that we've defined the constructor and the instance variables, let's see how we can add other methods to a TypeScript class. Well, this is also going to be pretty similar to how we added methods to classes in JavaScript, but again, not only do we have static typing, but we also are allowed to add these visibility modifiers to our methods. So if, for example, we wanted to define a public method, right, a method that any code outside this human class is allowed to call on an instance, then we can just say public, and we'll call this something like introduce yourself, okay? And what we'll have this method do is we'll just have it say console.log, and in backticks here, we'll say hello, my name is, and then of course we'll insert the name from this person instance into the string by saying this dot name. And you could of course add the age and hair color in there somewhere as well. I'm just going to leave it at this dot name. All right, now in this case, this method that we defined didn't take any arguments or return any value. So let's see what methods look like that take arguments and return values. Well, for arguments, what that might look like is we could say public, and we'll define another version of this introduce yourself method called introduce yourself to that takes a name as an argument, that takes a name as an argument of the person that we want this person to introduce themselves to. So what that would look like is we could say console.log, and then in backticks we'll say hello, and then insert that name there, and then we'll say my name is, and then this dot name. Okay? All right, so as you can see here, defining arguments in methods is pretty much the same as defining arguments in regular functions, right? Where we can just add the type that that argument should have after the argument name. So if we want to have these return a value, what that's going to look like is, well, what that might look like is instead of console.log, let's just have this return the introduction, right? So that maybe we could print that out after. And what we'll do is we'll just change the name of this method to something like get introduction, okay? All right, now because we're returning this string, if you hover over the name of this method, you'll see that TypeScript will automatically infer that type for us. But if you want to have it specifically defined here to make sure that no matter what, that type of value is returned, what you can do is you can add a colon after the function name and then string. Again, this is much like defining regular functions in TypeScript. So that's how we would define the specific return type of a function. And we could do that for this method down here as well by saying get introduction to, and this would return a string as well, okay? And of course, it's going to warn us that this isn't currently returning a string, which is kind of the nice thing about static typing too. So let's say return hello, and then we'll remove those parentheses, and there we go. Okay, so at this point we have a pretty simple class here called human. So let's take a look at the way that we can define instances of a class and actually use them. All right, so what we're going to do here is we're going to say let person equals, and then we'll say new human. And of course, we're going to pass the name, age, and hair color arguments to this constructor. So let's just say Sean. We'll do 123 for the age, and for the hair color, we'll say brown. And there we go. And you can see that TypeScript doesn't like us having this same name person, so we'll just change this to a human. So we'll say let human equals new human. And now we can call methods on this new instance that we created just by saying something like console.log human.getIntroduction. And let's just try running this code now. First of all, we're going to compile our TypeScript code just by running tsc inside our terminal. And as you can see, that creates this build folder with app.js and classbasics.js. So let's run our classbasics.js file by saying node, and then build/classbasics.js. And sure enough, we see that that prints out, hello, my name is Sean. So going back now, let's just try calling the getIntroductionTo method now, and we'll pass Bob as an argument. So now if we recompile our code and run that code again, we'll see that sure enough, it says, hello, Bob, my name is Sean. All right, so anyway, that's the basics of defining classes in TypeScript and creating instances of those classes. And it's worth noting too that you can create more than one instance, and all of these instance variables will be different values, right? So we could create another human by saying let human2 equals new human. we'll say Bob, and we'll say that Bob and I both have the same age, and then we'll say that Bob has black hair, okay? And in this case, we could say console.log, and then we'll say human2.getIntroduction to Sean. And if we run our code again, oops, we need to actually recompile it, of course. So we'll recompile our code. And if we run that code again, we'll see that sure enough, the instance variables on that second instance that we created are different and lead to a different result from that method. So one last thing that I wanted to point out is, while in app.ts, we saw that we could define a custom type by using this type syntax and using this big long object type declaration with all of the properties and types inside of it, there's actually a slightly different way that we can do this in TypeScript, and that is using interfaces, right? So interfaces in TypeScript, instead of defining some sort of behavior like we did in this class, interfaces allow us to simply define a sort of signature or a sort of set of requirements that an object has to fulfill in order to be considered belonging to that interface, so to speak. All right, so if we were to define an interface and call it something like has name, right, or something like named object or something like that, we could define a group of objects that have names by just saying name string, and now any object that belongs to this named object interface, right? So if we say something like let dog named object, then TypeScript is going to force this object to have the property name, right? And we'll say, I don't know, Spot. All right, and now we would know that this object has the property name. So interfaces in TypeScript can be used not just for defining properties, but also for defining different methods, right? If you want to know that a method is going to exist, you could say that this named object interface has a getName method, and that would look like this. We could just say getName and put parentheses after it. And then if we're assuming that that method is, let's say, going to return a string, we could just put a colon and say string. And now we can see that TypeScript is saying that this dog variable needs a getName method. So we could just say getName and define it like this. And we could say return this dot name. And that would get rid of the warning there. Okay, so interfaces can be very useful, and we'll see a little bit later on how interfaces in TypeScript can be used to do things like help enforce design patterns in TypeScript programs. So anyway, hopefully this has given you a good introduction to the basics of creating custom types in TypeScript, whether that's by using type declarations like we saw how to do here, or by defining custom classes or interfaces like we saw how to do here. But obviously these things are very useful things to know how to do in TypeScript programs, and they really allow us to take full advantage of TypeScript's static typing system.